Erin is the mother of Max and the wife of Bill. She is a speaker, a grief educator, and an author of An Unexpected Journey. And it delves into grief and mental illness and suicide awareness and faith.
June 3rd, 2020 was the night, or the morning, that my husband and I got the calls that no parent ever wants to get. And that was that sometime the night before, our 25-year-old son had taken his life. And I remember I was still laying in bed when I heard my husband come crashing up the stairs. And before he even entered the room, I heard him say, "Max is gone, he's gone." And I remember the thought that went through my head was, gone where? And in retrospect, it's just interesting, the things that go through your mind during a traumatic time. And when I look back on those first hours as we began the daunting task of calling friends and family to let them know that we had lost our Max, we started each conversation with the words, "We lost him," as if we could find him again, if we tried. And those first days and weeks following his death are really a blur. I was just talking to one of the moms at my table about this. And I have learned that that is actually a protective mechanism, that our brain simply can't absorb everything that we have dealt to us at once. And so only snippets can come into play. And again, we started those first few weeks writing his obituary, planning his memorial service and his visitation, all tasks that a parent never should have to do. And so tonight, what I want to do is I want to share a little bit about what we've learned about mental illness, what we've learned about suicide loss, what I've learned about grief, and how the Lord has walked alongside me through this. But before I dive into that, I want to help you get to know my boy. So this is my Max, and as you can see, he was a beautiful, beautiful boy. Beautiful baby with that big round fat head, and a beautiful little boy with those chubby cheeks. He was, in retrospect, the most interesting person I've ever known, and I don't say that just because I'm his mom. He really was. He was incredibly intelligent as a little guy. He talked in sentences at 15 months. He read his first Harry Potter book between kindergarten and first grade. He was just incredibly smart, creative, sensitive, tender-hearted. As a big guy, he wrote poetry, short stories. He played the drums and the banjo. He did stand-up comedy. He was really an interesting boy. But the thing I love most about him was his sweet and tender heart. And I ultimately think that that was what did him in. So this is the last picture that we have of our family. This was taken Mother's Day of 2020. And if I had known that was going to be the last time we were all together, I think I would have hung on to him and hugged him a little harder. This is my favorite picture of us, though. This is he and I at the vow renewal that my husband Bill and I did in 2017. And we wanted both of our boys to be involved in that day, so we asked Max to give us a toast. And as I mentioned, he was a comic, so we were expecting maybe more of a roast than a toast. But our boy gave us the most beautiful, heartfelt tribute, and I'm so grateful that I have his words. I have a videotape of that event, and I have this beautiful picture, and it really captures our relationship. Me holding his sweet face in my hands and him with that little smile on his face. He was the light of my life. And I would be remiss if I didn't introduce his dog. This is Emmy Lou, and we now have Emmy Lou, custody of her, and she is just a love. She is the most intuitive, loyal, loving dog that I have ever met. When I start to get upset, she is by my side in an instant, and I think she was that way for Max too, a bit of a therapy dog. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned as it relates to mental illness. And the first thing is that depression is so misunderstood. Our Max struggled with depression and anxiety, as I'm sure many of your kids did as well. And I think that oftentimes we think of depression as a passing mood or a character flaw or a weakness or a lack of faith, and it's none of those things. It's a medical condition. Okay, so I've learned that the opposite of depression is not happiness, it's motivation. We learned that from one of Max's therapists, and boy, was that difficult to understand. You know, what we learned is that depression zaps a person of the motivation to do the most basic of things, to get out of bed, to go to the bathroom. And I did not understand that. And so when Max would be struggling with one of his depressive episodes, I would do anything to get him out of bed. I remember one time dragging him out of bed, dragging him to Target, and dragging him around the store. And that was not productive for him. That was something that made me feel better. And so when I look back, I wish that I had just gotten into the bed beside him and rubbed his back and told him he would make it through, because he probably felt like I didn't see him or understand what he was experiencing. The other thing that we learned about depression is that trying to find medication that works is like trying to find shoes without knowing your size. You know, that is also a really hard thing to wrap your head around. You know, in this day and age, we get sick, we take a pill, and we're better. If you have a headache, you take an Advil, and you feel fine. But that is not the case with mental illness. It is very much trial and error to try to determine if a medication is going to work. And the thing about psychiatric medications is that they take a certain period of time to get to a therapeutic level. And then, if it doesn't work, you have to titrate off that and start a new one. And when we went to clean out Max's room after he died, he had an entire Trader Joe's grocery bag full of medications that he had tried that hadn't worked. Again, I mentioned this. Depression is a disease like diabetes or heart disease. And we treat mental illness and physical illness so very differently. In addition to his depression diagnosis, Max also had a diagnosis of epilepsy and 2 conditions of the brain, right? And when we would share his epilepsy diagnosis with friends and family, we got a completely different response. We would get a much more compassionate and understanding response to the epilepsy than we did to the mental illness. When we talked about his epilepsy, people would say, "Oh my gosh, that has to be so hard for him. I'm so sorry." And when we talked about his depression, people would say, "What does he have to be depressed about?" So very different in the way that we treat the two. I think that this chart really sums it up, and if you will bear with me, I'd like to read through it, because I think reading through it and looking at the contrast is powerful. So in mental illness, the sufferer gets blamed. In physical illness, they get cared for. In mental illness, the person is told to get over it. In physical illness, they're told you'll be supported through it. In mental illness, the person is told to take responsibility for your problems. In physical illness, they're told, ask for help anytime. In mental illness, the person is criticized for being weak and lazy. In physical illness, the person is praised for being strong and courageous. In mental illness, the person is told, stop being so self-indulgent. In physical illness, they're told, it's a hard road, be kind to yourself. In mental illness, the person is told, it's a choice. In physical illness, they're told, there's nothing you could have done to avoid this. We have a long way to go in treating mental illness the same way that we treat physical illness. The other thing that we've learned is that mental illness is often demonized and criminalized. When there is a mental health crisis and a 911 call is made, it is the law enforcement that is dispatched to handle that situation. Not a medical professional, not a counselor, not a crisis counselor, police officers. And our police officers have a tough enough job to do without sending them to a situation that they're not equipped and trained to handle. And so oftentimes these situations just escalate out of control. And sometimes the person suffering the mental health crisis can be injured or even killed. I love this chart that shows all of the different factors that come into play with our mental health. So things like environment, relationships, physical health, genetics, substance use, diet, stress, trauma. And the interesting thing is if we replace that little pink bubble with the words mental health, it's those same factors that influence our physical health. So again, it just goes to show that we are a whole person. We're comprised of all of these different parts, and yet we tend to treat mental and physical illness so very differently when the same factors tend to influence both. This is a statistic from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and according to their research, 67% of adults in the US believe they have had a mental health condition at some point in their life. And I think that's important to understand because I think a lot of times we think a person is either mentally ill or mentally healthy forever. And that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes we can have a temporary mental health condition that affects us. And although grief is not a mental health issue, I think we can all agree that it impacts us mentally. So that's important to know. I want to talk a little bit about suicide, and one of the things that I learned after losing our Max is that rather than say someone committed suicide, it's better to say they died by suicide. And that's because the word committed has negative connotations. It has connotations that lean towards the illegal and the immoral. We say someone committed adultery, committed murder, committed a crime. And suicide is a tragedy. It is not a crime, and it should be treated as such. And terminology really matters. The way that we speak about suicide really does make a difference in either perpetuating the stigma or reducing the stigma. Again, suicide is a tragedy, not a scandal. Depressed people need help, not shame, not avoidance. And I think all of the things that we've looked at up until now help to illustrate that. Since we lost our Max, we have become involved in the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP. And if you're not familiar, they offer walks called Out of the Darkness walks, really around the country, usually in about September, because that's Suicide Awareness Month. But these are walks that seek to raise awareness of suicide loss and also seek to gather people together who have been touched by suicide. And so we participated in several of those walks, and I can tell you it is both comforting and sobering to see the number of people who have been touched by suicide. Also, you probably know about the 988 crisis line. So that replaced a very long 1-8, I think it was a 188 or a 1-800 number. So now when someone is suffering a mental health crisis, they can call that hotline. And also the semicolon has become kind of the symbol for the suicide prevention movement because it indicates a pause rather than a period. It indicates a continuation of a life rather than an end to a life. So if you've seen that, that's what it represents. Now I want to get into talking about grief. And when I tell you that I was overwhelmed by my grief, it is a massive understatement. I had no idea what grief was all about until we lost Max. I had lost grandparents, but they were elderly, they had lived their lives. And so to lose a 25-year-old son, I didn't know how to process that. I didn't know what to do with that. And so as I've really dived into learning about grief, it has helped me tremendously. And so I'd like to share some of the things that I've learned. And one of them is that grief is love with nowhere to go. You know, my love for Max didn't die with him. It remains to this day. It'll remain until I take my last breath. And so the fact that I have all this love for him and I don't have him to show it to, I don't have his sweet face to kiss, I don't have him to hug, it's just all of that love with nowhere to go. And that is really, I know you all can relate to that. That is one of the hardest things. And the other thing I believe is that oftentimes our grief is proportional to our love. And we loved our kids more than ourselves. And so, of course, we're going to feel this overwhelming and all-encompassing grief. Our culture treats grief like a problem to be solved. Has anyone else experienced that? People try to say something to fix it, make it all better, make it go away. And it is not a problem to be solved. It is something to be experienced, and it's best experienced with others by our side. So the stages of grief, we've all been presented with them, and if you're like me, they made me so angry to think that I was going to go from this stage to this stage to this stage. I have since learned they're not linear. They were never intended to be 5 simple steps to get over your grief, but at first I thought they were. And I like this illustration because it shows that it's not linear, that we can experience all of those stages, all of those feelings really at the same time. In the same day, in the same hour, certainly in the same week, and we revisit them again and again and again as our grief goes on. So I really struggled with acceptance. I remember saying, what does acceptance of my son's death even look like? Because I felt like acceptance indicated approval, that I was okay with what happened. And I will never be okay with Max's death, just like you all will probably never be okay with the death of your children. But once I realized that acceptance was simply acknowledging that he was gone, I was able to process it a little bit better. But when I was stuck on the side of it's raining, all I could think about was all the things I hated about the fact that he was no longer here. And once I was able to take a step back and say, he's gone, he's really gone, and I'm gonna have to figure out how to live the rest of my life without him. And I felt like that was really a pivotal point in my grief journey. So we already talked a little bit about this. You know, the stages of grief are not linear, they were never intended to be. And I really think we need to rename them to cycles of grief. And again, they're not prescriptive in what you will feel, but they might be helpful in understanding what you might experience. And I think that's an important distinction as well. So, I don't know if anybody else was surprised, but I was shocked that grief impacted me emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually, but I'll get to that in a minute. I honestly thought that grief was just emotional. And then after Max died, I started to experience all of these physical symptoms. At first it was things like, you know, difficulty sleeping and headaches and an upset stomach all the time. And I actually had a form of depression myself. The summer after Max died, I couldn't get out of bed. And I had never experienced a depression before. And so that was really shocking to me, that I would experience all of these symptoms, and without really understanding that that's so common. It is so very common to experience mental, emotional, and physical symptoms when we're grieving. So there's a lot of people probably in all of our lives who wonder when we're going to stop grieving.
Yeah.
And the answer is never. And again, I was talking to one of the moms at my table about this. The grief usually doesn't stay at the same intensity as it is in the beginning, but we carry it for the rest of our lives. And that goes back to that love, right? We loved our children, so therefore we're going to grieve for them as long as we are still breathing.
Every holiday.
Every holiday, yep. Every milestone. So I love this Bible verse because I think it really provides us with a roadmap of how we want people to be with us when we're grieving and how we can come alongside others when they're grieving. And this Bible verse, rejoice with those who rejoice, share their joy, and weep with those who weep, share their grief. And so you'll notice that it doesn't say cheer up those who weep, or distract those who weep, or admonish those who weep. It just says to share, weep with them and share their grief. And when we share somebody's grief, we're not judging them, we're not ignoring them, and we're just simply witnessing their grief, and that's what we need. The number one need of those that are grieving is to have our pain witnessed. And that is really hard for people to do. They don't like to see us in pain, so they try to do things to get us out of it without knowing that they really can't. So I heard this somewhere, and I think it's wonderful. When someone's going through a trial, show up and shut up. And, when I think about all of, just for lack of a better word, stupid stuff people said to us after we lost Max, it is frankly a wonder I didn't punch somebody. And, people don't mean to say something that is hurtful, but oftentimes they do. And what we really just need them is to be alongside us, just to bless us with their presence. So I did my Grief Educator certification through David Kessler Training. He is really one of the preeminent grief experts in this country. And he has a lot of good little quotes, and this is one of them. Grief is work, avoiding grief is even more work. And, we need to experience and process our grief. Time does not heal all wounds. The passage of time helps if we process our grief in productive ways. So my faith had really been shaken by our loss. So Max struggled pretty intensely for about 6 years with his mental illness. And he was hospitalized numerous times for suicide ideation, so we always knew that we could potentially lose him. But when he died, I still felt like the rug was pulled out from under me. I prayed for him every single day for those years. We had prayer gatherings in our home. I anointed his room with oil. And he was on the prayer lists of, I'm not kidding, probably 100 people. And I remember it was about a year and a half before we lost him. I was walking through my neighborhood, and I really felt like the Lord said to me, he's going to be okay. So of course I thought that meant he'd be okay here. And I thought, oh, Lord, praise you. He is going to have this remarkable story of restoration and healing and redemption, and he is going to share it with the world. And so when he died, I thought, this isn't the way the story was supposed to go. And at first I was kind of incredulous and shocked, and then I became very, very angry at the Lord. And I couldn't understand why the Lord wouldn't want to heal him and have him give the glory to God. But the Lord had other plans. And the book of Job has really served as a comfort to me. I didn't think it would at first, but it has. And I love this Bible verse. I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. The first day that we lost Max, our pastors came to our house. And our senior pastor gave me 2 pieces of advice that I'm so grateful for. The first was, people are going to want to show up, let them. And within hours, our house was full of people. I didn't know that was customary. I didn't know that's what happened when we lost a loved one. But I'm very grateful for the loving support of our faith community that surrounded us. And the second thing he said to me was, God can handle whatever you throw at him. He can handle your anger. He can handle your doubts. He can handle your indifference. And I threw it all at him over the course of the next year or so. And I am so grateful that I had that permission, because otherwise I might not have, and then I would have felt guilty for feeling the way that I felt, and I don't know where I would be. So I'm so grateful that, again, he gave me that permission to really cry out to the Lord in the bitterness of my soul. And I believe the Lord met me there. I know the Lord met me there. So I remember this was probably right around the 16th month after losing Max. I was in church, because even though I was angry with God, I kept doing everything that I had been doing. We continued to go to church. I continued to do Bible studies. I continued, just to do all of the things that I always had done. Although I did them with apathy and kind of indifference. But I remember one day I was sitting in church, and there were 2 worship songs that played. And have you ever had that moment where you feel like you're the only person in the room, and those songs or that message is just for you? Mm-hmm. That's the way I felt that day. And I remember leaving and thinking that Jesus was pulling me closer. And even though when I look back, I see God's hand all over the place, his providence, his provision, his presence. I couldn't see it at the time. I could only see it in retrospect. But I now know, almost 5 years later, that he has been with me every step of the way, and I am so grateful for that. I don't know where I would be otherwise. So I want to share some tips that I've learned along the way, and these are outlined in my book, which is back on that table. And the first one is therapy. So I was established with a therapist prior to losing Max because he struggled for a long time. And so I needed that support, and I am so grateful that I had her to continue to see afterwards because she helped me tremendously. She not only helped me process my grief, but she helped me better relate to my husband, because husbands and wives grieve the loss of a child completely differently. At least we did, and I've heard that from many others. And so she was instrumental. Bill and I had also been seeing a marriage counselor prior to losing Max, and that proved to be not only incredibly helpful before we lost him, but since. And so I think that I can't say enough about marriage therapy or couples therapy. I think it can be hugely helpful. The other thing I can't say enough about are support groups. It took us about a year to join one. I didn't even know that I needed one because I had my own therapist. We had a marriage therapist, we had support of friends and family, a huge faith community. And it wasn't until we joined a support group at around the 12-month mark that I realized what was missing. And it was this. It was being with people who understood what we had experienced. As supportive as our friends and our family and our faith community were, none of them had lost a child. And so that support group, I remember being so relieved the very first time I attended, and it was via Zoom because this was still COVID. I remember seeing all those little faces in a box nodding their heads, and afterwards I wept because I felt so validated, so understood, and so seen. And so I really can't say enough about support groups. I had to take medication for a while, and I do not view that as a weakness. I think it's one of the tools that we have available to us, and I don't have to take it anymore. It was just a short period of time, but it really helped me function. And so that was another tip. Creative outlets. So the summer we lost Max, I'm a big gardener. We got a tree, we got a bench, we got a stone, we got various plaques and things. And so we installed a memorial garden for him on our property. And that was so helpful for me to have something physical to do with my grief. And the other creative outlet that I engaged in was journaling. When I was seeing my therapist after losing Max, I couldn't make sense of my swirling thoughts and feelings. And so she encouraged me to journal. And that was really helpful in releasing some of them and naming them. Because in my head, I couldn't name them. But once I got them out, I could. So journaling was hugely, hugely helpful for me. The other thing I learned is that numbing your feelings doesn't work. It might temporarily, but not long term. And the number of ways that we can numb ourselves are vast. Things like busyness, things like TV, shopping, drugs, alcohol, eating, all sorts of ways we can numb our feelings. But it's really important to feel them, to sit in them and feel them. And then the other one is to reframe expectations, both for ourselves and for others. I remember kind of white-knuckling that first year, thinking if I just can get through this first year, if I can just make it to that 12 months, I'll be okay. And then when the 12th month came and went, and I didn't feel better, in some ways felt even worse, because all the firsts were behind me. And now I was just staring down forever without my son. That year expectation that I put on myself really did me some harm. And I think other people oftentimes project their expectations onto us. How long they think we should grieve, how we should grieve. And so I just think oftentimes we need to reframe expectations both for ourselves and others. Do you have a question?
I just have one more that you could have added to that helps me immensely.
What is that?
Community service. I do backpacks for my son on his birthday for the homeless.
Oh, I love that.
And it helps me a lot.
I love that. Yeah, giving back is huge. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. So those are some tips that help me, and I'm sure you all have others. but I think it's important to find ways to kind of get through our grief, navigate it. So I mentioned the journaling that I did, and ultimately those journal entries kind of evolved into a book. I never sat down and thought, I'm gonna write a book. I just started journaling, and then I started putting some of those journal entries on social media and got really positive response. I think it was on social media, somebody said, you should write a book. And I thought, okay, maybe I will. So I found a really beautiful and talented illustrator and graphic designer at my church and home. She had experience with mental illness and suicide loss, and so we really worked well together. And over the course of about the first 18 months after losing Max, I was journaling, then I was working with her to put together this book. And I am immensely proud of the resource we have created. And when I look back, that's one of God's provisions and just providences. He was directing that the whole way, and I didn't even realize it. So I'm very, very proud of that resource. And the bird, the significance of the bird, so Sarah Nelsen is my illustrator. I kept seeing the same bird in the days and weeks following Max's death. And so when Sarah read my first few journal entries, she said, let's make the bird the theme of the book. So she did these 6 original watercolor illustrations of a bird that appear throughout the book, and it's just beautiful. I'm just so grateful to her for taking what was in my head and putting it on paper. So I mentioned, or actually Michelle mentioned, I'm a grief educator, and so I offer online grief groups for bereaved parents. And I do them online, then people can join from wherever. I think sometimes when we're grieving, the thought of getting dressed and getting in our car and going somewhere is too daunting. So people can join from wherever. And I offer, they're short term, they're 6 weeks long. And again, I think that 6-week chunk is just enough to feel like you can sign up for that. So those I offer periodically throughout the year. And I just encourage you to find me and follow me on social media. Check out my website that kind of has everything about what I'm doing. You can keep up to date with me. And one of the other things that you'll see on my website is I also contributed to a book called Stories of Children Lost. Stories of Children Lost. It is an anthology. There are stories in there from 8 different parents who have lost children. And I think it really can provide some comfort for parents that are grieving so they don't feel so alone.